Welcome to This Might Get Us in Trouble. I'm your host, Josh Hellbach. Today I'm joined by Mitchell Hurl, and we will be discussing the Ukrainian conflict. So, the reason we got into this is because I had no idea what was going on with Ukraine and why we were threatening to send UN and American forces there to fend off Russia, who currently has approximately 130,000 troops amassed across the border, threatening invasion.
Wow. That's a lot of troops.
Yes. So before we get into it, we're going to set a little bit of a baseline on what's going on to better explain the current cause for conflict. But first, Mitch, what do you know about Ukraine?
Not a lot. Not a lot, Josh.
Okay.
So yeah, how about I ask you questions?
No, let's set
about this setup.
We're gonna set the history first here. All right.
Sure.
So Ukraine is also where. Ukraine happens to be the most corrupt country in the world when it comes to its political leaders, right? It was formerly a state of the Soviet Union up until the mid-1900s. Don't give me the lie on a date. Late 1900s. Yep, they became their own state and joined the
1990s.
Yep, UN after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And ever since then, they have been plagued with corruption and debt problems. They have been heavily influenced by Russia, and they are Eastern European, and a lot of the culture of Ukraine and Russia have overlap. Same with Crimea, which we will get into later, which is very important to understand with the conflict currently going on between Ukraine, Russia, the EU, and the US. Their main export is military equipment and natural gas. That's really all they have going for them. Their GDP is $170 billion, which is, in comparison to Wisconsin, where we are, it's less than half of the GDP of Wisconsin. So it's a very small economic power. And they have had a pretty volatile political history, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The people there identify with many Eastern ideologies like Russian and Czech. They're not very Western. They're much more old school Catholic, and they're fairly old school in the way that they think, and we can get into that a little bit more because I didn't explain it very well. But what are your questions about it first?
Yeah, well, let's get a setup to the conflict.
Okay.
So, why does Russia want Ukraine?
Right. So Ukraine currently is massively in debt, and they have been for a while due to their corruption. Okay, so their GDP, as I said before, is about $160 billion. Their debt is $82 billion. So they're at a 61% debt to GDP ratio, and by the IMF, that puts them basically in a default state. Now, we'll quickly explain the IMF, which is really important to understand when we're getting into this. The IMF is...
Let me just backtrack here. I think that's actually completely false. 60% debt to GDP is actually pretty good.
No, they're 61, which sets them over the boundary.
Well, for reference, like the U.S. is at 110%.
Right, and we'll get yes.
Japan. So how is that different? Is their credit rating?
Because they're not an economic superpower. They're very small. Okay. Now, that generally wouldn't matter that much.
Could I ask one more question?
Of course.
Is it part of the? Is it part of the euro?
No.
The Ukraine.
So the Ukrainian dollar is worth very little.
Okay.
If nothing.
Okay.
So, let's quickly go and explain the IMF. So the IMF is the International Monetary Fund and is mostly almost entirely backed by the U.S. dollar. And multinational banks. So some of the biggest contributors to the IMF are Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan. Yeah, so the IMF is almost entirely controlled by US banks, even though they give out a lot of money to Western and third world countries, or many third world countries. Ukraine is more of a second world country, but it's really important to understand that the IMF does not give out actual funds. They give out SDR, which is special drawing rights. These special drawing rights are essentially credits that the IMF gives out to countries so that they can use that as a debt reference for
Collateral to
collateralized.
borrow against.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So this has been, they joined the IMF as almost as soon as they became their own state, which was around the fall of the Soviet Union. At that point, they essentially became a vassal state of the US, which is very important to understand in regards to the US's involvement in this conflict. They are seen as the
So
Israel
how were they initially involved? How were the
of
U.S.
Europe.
and Ukraine initially involved?
So that goes back to the Cold War. Okay, so Ukraine's first, when Ukraine was part of um, when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, the leaders in Ukraine were pushing to become independent, and the push and the financial support for those leaders to come into power was completely funded and supported by the CIA as a part of the economic warfare against the Soviet Union during the mid 1900s. You have to understand that the Cold War was not won by bullets or by nukes. It was won by economic weapons. Those being debt, GDP, and trade agreements. And Ukraine was instrumental in the destabilization of Russia and the fall of or destabilization of the USSR and fall of the USSR. Since then, it has essentially been a vassal state of the US, which then gets us into Burisma, which is
Okay.
yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah. So Burisma is a natural gas company from Ukraine. It might as well. So Burisma is, as I said, a natural gas company that is fairly controlled by the Ukrainian government, and you might have heard Burisma before because it came out in the Hunter email documents. And Burisma paid Hunter Biden to be on their board of executives. Do you remember the exact number?
180,000 a month.
180,000, yes, $130,000 a month to be on their board of directors. Yeah, Hunter Biden has absolutely no experience in natural gas or any form of energy
Well,
sector.
I actually think the Burisma Ukrainian government connection is it's pretty much certain.
Yeah, it's they're
Because
almost one and the same.
right,
Yeah.
because Hunter Biden working for Burisma was basically part of Joe Biden's
International
giving
foreign policy.
Ukraine subsidies
Yes.
of
Yeah.
billions of dollars
Yep. So
through the U.S. government.
absolutely. So
US
after the Cold War ended, there were still a lot of ties between the U.S. and a lot of the countries that they had supported during the Cold War. There are these kind of remnant vassal states that we got in so deep that we couldn't really get out, and we still owed them a lot of monetary favors, sort of. And there was a lot of money to be made for politicians that made these deals happen. So in 2008, Obama was elected, and then in 2010, there was an internal investigation on Hunter Biden and Joe Biden in regards to international corruption. As we've said before, Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world when it comes to its leaders. Because of that, Biden pushed, and you can look up the video, he pushed for the head investigator on this corruption case to be fired and replaced if the country wanted to get any more IMF or US funding. A couple weeks later, the investigation was dropped on Hunter Biden and Joe Biden, and the investigator was fired, and a suitable replacement was put in. Biden said all this in a press conference in 2014. This is undeniable fact. It's happened. He used his power as vice president to alter and change change policy, and used the money that we were going to give Ukraine as a bribe, as a bribe.
Right.
In return for that, Biden and the Bidens profited massively because of this. And how did it affect Joe Biden? Because in the Hunter email scandal, we found that 10% of that $180,000 a month was going to none other than Joe Biden. And as we have come to learn recently, Biden and his son are far more close than we previously thought, and Hunter Biden has a lot more influence on the White House than we thought a crackhead ever should.
Okay. All right. So we have a Burisma connection. All right.
Yes.
So how does this tie into Russia's troop presence on the
Right.
border?
Why do we give a crap about Ukraine, a country that has a GDP that is, half the size of really any state in the U.S., right?
GDP wise, yeah.
GDP wise, it doesn't matter,
It
right?
is geographically pretty large.
Geographically, it is fairly large, and geopolitically, it is in a very good location for Russia. This is when we get into debt, the IMF, and the influence of banks on politics. Because wars are not currently fought by men with guns. They are currently fought by men in suits that give out loans and use economic weapons to fight their enemies. Debt is the most important weapon that the financial system has currently. Ukraine did something interesting, though. They borrowed about 50-50 in regards to where they got their money, because they have about $40 billion in debt to Russian banks and $40 billion in debt to the IMF and alternative Western banks. Whoever takes over Ukraine, and we'll get back to exactly why the war is breaking out on a socioeconomic front.
They get the debt.
They get the debt,
Yeah.
and the other debt is either cleared or then defaulted.
Yeah.
And who are you going to default? Russia? Well, then now you're dealing with Russia, and as we know, they're not the biggest fan of paying back to Western banks. So this is a debt war, and also geopolitical. So you get your money with very little risk, because it's a geopolitically, GDP-wise, insignificant, and then you're able to determine what the debt is, and you can essentially, either country can essentially default Ukraine and take over. Now, here comes the sociological aspect of this. Ukrainians identify as Russian.
Some.
Many.
Some.
The Western
It's close to 15%.
No.
Identify as Russian. Yeah.
Identify as Russian, but the Western values, and so you've got the EU on one side and you've got Russia on the other. The people in Ukraine identify with Russian values far more than they identify with EU values. You have to understand that Putin is a populist. And everyone in Ukraine is currently looking at Crimea. Crimea, under Russian rule, over the last 2 years, has doubled its GDP.
Wow.
So you got all these Ukrainians living in mediocre, almost poverty, looking at Crimea, seeing what the Russians were able to do for their businesses, because currently the EU doesn't really get along with Ukraine, because they're worried about putting any extra money into Ukraine as investments, because it's so corrupt. From the government perspective, the people are great, but from a government perspective, it is so divided in regards to its underground ties between Russia, the U.S., and the banking system, that no one really trusts the government. And the people of Ukraine see what's happening in Crimea, see the massive investment they're getting from the Russian government and the populist leader Putin is, and see that as a way out of their current economic state. There's also obviously a resistance towards this, and it's an internal conflict in the country. But from a geoeconomic standpoint, many Ukrainians are geopolitically conservative, whereas many of the members of the EU, Germany, Greece, are economically socialist.
Yeah.
And they don't really want to be part of that because they don't want to pay into the EU's ever-growing debt and ever-growing problems. Because at their core, they're very Catholic, and they're also what's the word? Eastern Orthodox Catholic. That's the
Sure,
word I was
sure,
looking
sure.
for. And though they are very traditional in their view of gay marriage, immigration, Western values, they're not the most liberal people, especially in consideration. They identify far more with Russian values than they do with or Western European values.
Okay. Yeah. So that being said, what do you see happening?
I think that there's probably going to be some sort of armed conflict. Yeah,
Okay.
because even though the people may want one way or the other, uh, and this a lot of the information I'm getting is from a scholar in the area called Matthew Raphael Johnson, and he's studied it, written 6 books on it, and I've read a few of his books over the last few days in regards to this, and his viewpoint, and he's probably the most scholarly resource in the field that is not tainted by
Bias,
bias. Yeah,
ideology.
right, exactly. And he believes there will be a conflict because of the debt, which does make a lot of sense, but it'll probably be fairly short lived. There's little evidence that the U.S. has any fortitude to go into another foreign war at the moment
Right.
after what we saw with Afghanistan.
Right.
So the EU might try to, but in regards to military might, Russia really has the upper hand in regards to it. And if the people want it, the people will get it. So it really comes down to the people of Ukraine. And in regards to the debt, that's where we get into some interesting. I mean, it's very hard to understand what exactly will happen, and I'm not going to make any estimations about it. I just thought that the debt issue was very interesting to me as an economic warfare, really.
Yeah. So let's examine this from Russia's perspective. Strict,
Yeah.
strategically. Um, so Russia could invade Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
And in a way capture their debt for basically the cost of the military deployment.
Yep.
But Europe also trades very heavily with Russia, mainly natural gas, and as I understand it, Europe or the EU and many of its constituents would would impose sanctions if Russia were to
I'm happy you
invade
brought that
Ukraine.
up. Yeah.
So how from Russia's
So
standpoint,
Russia's biggest
what
export
do you do?
to the EU currently is natural gas with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 I believe goes through Ukraine. One of them goes through Ukraine.
That's probably Nord Stream 1 because Nord
Yeah.
Stream 2 is north,
Okay.
Lithuania and
Yep.
Latvia.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So this came out today. Germany currently is at 60% or 40% of its natural gas reserves. They get all of their natural gas from Germany, or from Germany gets all of its natural gas from Russia. Okay, so Russia is using its main export as a weapon to essentially push these other countries out of the conflict, such as Germany and such as the EU, because for going into winter, they're going to need this natural gas. They can't build up in time, so they're trying to bully the EU out of it because ultimately Ukraine is kind of a drag on the EU economically
So it's not
because
it's
they don't
not it's
really.
not part of the EU,
Yeah, but they don't really like. There's not a great relationship between the EU and Ukraine.
right?
There is, if as I said, there's it's really between Russia and the U.S. because, as we've said before, due to Cold War ties, the Ukraine is really a vassal state of the U.S. They haven't really had a free and fair election there, since their inception, because it has been so influenced by the CIA and U.S. foreign policy, which, view that how you like,
Right.
but Russia really wants it because of its connection to Southern Europe. It allows them to really compete energy wise with those southern countries,
I
such
see.
as Saudi
So
Arabia
Ukraine
and
is a natural gas exporter.
yeah,
I.e. Burisma.
right,
Burisma exists because they can export natural
right,
gas. And you're saying that um, Nord Stream one, uh, the gas supply to Nord Stream one comes from Russia. It also comes from Ukraine.
yep,
And if Russia can get Ukraine and fully control the supply to both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, they have power over both southern and northern Europe
in regards
via
to their heating and
natural
cooling,
gas.
right, natural
Yes.
gas.
And I think it's also a very timely. It's very timely for Russia to put troops on the border in December,
Right,
the coldest or soon to be the coldest time of the year,
right.
when Germans know they can't not use natural gas.
Right.
So it's all very smart. So do you have an opinion on this? Do you want to see one thing happen over the
I
other?
mean, all I really don't, from a personal standpoint, I'd prefer us not to go to war again. Like, I really don't think there's any use in the U.S. sending troops over there
So I think
or the EU.
I
I don't
think
think
Joe
anyone should die
Biden
over this.
stated that we will not, under any circumstances, deploy troops to
Yeah,
Ukraine. So,
yeah,
assuming that's true,
yeah.
uh, what do you think the best thing for the world is?
I think at this point, currently geopolitically, yeah, Russia should probably take them over.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So why is
yeah.
that?
Call me a Russian agent, but yeah, I really think that's probably the best option right now,
And
especially for the people of Ukraine.
for the people of Ukraine.
Yeah,
And do you think that is a large threat to Southern Europe?
no, and also Southern Europe is
Why not?
on the brink of collapse and has been for a while.
Okay, so
When you're
you're
talking about countries like, you know, Greece, New Caledonia, or not New Caledonia, what's it called? Greece, Albania,
well,
um,
Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal. Those four are all very indebted.
yeah,
They're not doing well.
yeah, and they're all very much a drag on the Northern European countries.
That's true.
I don't really think the EU has done any of them hasn't done any Northern European countries any favors. Those Southern European countries, especially Mediterranean countries outside of Montenegro and
So
Monaco, are really drains on, other than Spain, obviously, are really drains
Spain
on the
too.
EU.
Spain is very indebted.
Oh, they are?
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works because those countries
Their
have
youth
really,
unemployment rate is north of 30%.
yeah.
18 and over. Youth being 18 to 34. Or
Oh,
something.
Lord.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of those Southern European countries are really, as I've said, like they're pretty lazy. Their cultures
Yes.
are very laissez-faire, and they don't have the same values as Northern Europeans in
So
any way.
so let me ask you this. So the Russian control over Nord Stream one, so cutting off natural gas.
Yeah,
Those four countries, who are already in the brink
yeah.
of collapse.
And the northern countries, which
Why
are
why do you
already
think that's a,
stretched pretty thin
because of the
because
southern?
of the southern countries.
So why do you think that's a good idea? Um, Maybe if I could answer my own question, do you think it'll put more pressure on the EU to change its system that's currently not functioning like efficiently?
Probably not. I don't think the leaders of the EU really have a whole lot of interest in, the leaders of the EU aren't very populist.
Okay.
They're pretty globalist.
Is it? Do you want to see Russia succeed because they're more populist than Europe?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
I
Okay.
personally like Russia more than I like the EU at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the EU, in regards to like general human well-being, I mean, the EU is pretty authoritarian, and Russia, surprisingly, isn't as authoritarian as the EU, which takes a lot, but
So
that's just the state of the world right now.
let me, if I could point out that Russia still does kill journalists.
Yeah,
Um, they don't
so
have.
do we.
That's true. That's true. Okay. Okay.
And do they censor journalists too?
So I guess Russia's more blatant about it.
They're very honest.
Right.
Yeah, they're
Okay.
very straightforward people.
To the rest of the world, who nobody really knows what news is disseminated internally
Yeah,
in Russia, right? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I follow RT, and they're pretty on it.
I do too, yeah, RT is actually very
Based.
yes.
So that's literally Russian television.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So that's just a stretch, because Russia doesn't necessarily hold Western values, and
They
it's
don't hold liberal values.
liberal values.
They are very conservative,
Right.
which I like.
Um, they're conservative in an Eastern Orthodox manner.
Yes,
So
and I'm a big fan of that.
right. I guess what I'm really getting at is like those certain inalienable rights.
They don't have those.
They don't have those.
No.
And that's
But
where I think there's a risk of Russia having more power versus, you know,
Russia is not
Europe.
in regards to like I don't. The Russia has almost zero. In regards to like the biggest threats facing America, I don't put Russia on the top five.
So I would
I
actually
think a more powerful Russia actually is beneficial for the U.S. because I believe China is currently our largest geopolitical enemy, and Russia and China do sort of get along, but China has severed some ties in regards to their connection with Russia, and the more powerful Russia is, the better that is for the U.S.
serves as like a counterbalance to China.
Yeah,
I could see that.
yeah,
Um, but Russia does have a history of trolling, basically, right? Um, of aggravating tensions.
yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. But they're
all
gonna
over
do
the
that
world,
regardless.
all over the world,
Yeah,
but in America too.
yeah,
And Americans sure are susceptible to that.
yeah.
But
That's due to our educational system, which we can get into at a different time.
totally agree. I I think Russia's a threat. I think it's top five. I don't think it's I don't think it's that important though.
Yeah,
So I think there's a there's a middle ground in
yeah,
everything. So I do think that Europe, whether you know align more with Europe or Russia, ideologically, uh, a strong Europe is good for the U.S.
I disagree.
Um, because they do share values.
I disagree.
In a way.
No, they don't.
Okay.
Name one country that shares values with the U.S. that's in the EU.
Okay. So what do you mean by values?
Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to do as you want, freedom of culture, cultural unity in regards to the country's general predisposition on freedom for all. I don't see any of that in those Eastern European countries, or sorry, Western European countries that are part of the EU. I see, they, in regards to the populace, they have little to no freedom in a in comparison to the U.S.
Okay. So I
They
think
don't have freedom of speech. They don't have any of our amendments. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of gathering. They don't have the right to bear arms. They do not have the right to freely assemble. And I mean, you can go through the list, and they don't have any of those freedoms or rights.
okay. All right. So but on the world stage, traditionally, European countries are our allies.
Traditionally,
So American troops uh, traditionally fight alongside French, German, Italian
traditionally, but
troops.
they have been co-opted by ultimately authoritarians.
So okay, so and I think I know where you're going with this. Uh, that your main concern is authoritarianism
Yeah.
and the institutions, the governments, the bureaucracies of Europe and the U.S. Are infiltrated, and thus the way to combat that is for a stronger Russia, because Russia is more inherently populist
And very
and
Eastern Orthodox.
anti-institutional.
They're very religious. Ultimately,
Okay,
um, they're far more Christian and based than any of those Eastern countries or Western countries. The rest of the EU has become incredibly secular, and it's very detrimental.
so so if I were to look at a Russian person, right, and
Yeah.
examine them based on their values, um, the amount of integrity they have, I think that a Russian standing alongside, you know, pick your European country
Yeah.
citizen, um, I have a lot more respect for a Russian person.
Agreed.
Yeah, um, but I think where I am not making uh, I'm not making the leap that because I respect the Russian people more,
Yeah.
that I think the Russian government should be more powerful. So
I
I think there's still risk in a more powerful Russian government.
I see it as like picking an enemy, and I would rather Russia be more powerful because they are not part of the EU than the EU be more powerful. I don't
Okay.
trust the EU. I don't trust their leaders. I think that they have really they've bought into authoritarianism hook, line, and sinker, and Russia has not, and that's why in this specific conflict I'm kind of leaning Russian,
So you could
and
almost
I
make a
really
point.
believe the U.S. should stay the fuck out of it.
I do yes, I do too.
We do
Um,
not want a war with Russia. It is not helpful for anyone.
right,
It's incredibly detrimental.
right. You could almost make the point that, and this is why I don't make that leap. You could almost make the point that the Chinese government, you'd want the Chinese government to be more powerful than the U.S.
No,
No,
no.
so because I look at a Chinese person, very respectable. This is my same
Disagree.
argument.
I disagree. They're brainwashed.
Okay, so the difference is that Russians are still based, and the
Russians
Chinese are
saw
brainwashed.
what horrors authoritarianism and ultimately socialism led to, and
And
they
you could argue
understand
that the Chinese
they do
did
not.
too, but
No,
they
they
just don't
don't.
carry it.
No, okay. You have to understand something. There is an incredible difference between the way we, as Westerners, including Russians, including Europeans, look at the world in comparison to somebody that is from China. It is insanely different. So, Russians, all the Russians alive today know what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution, right?
Right.
And before that, they were part of a class system, right?
Sure.
So they understand that Western progression, which is what the Europeans went through, and then ultimately what led the U.S. to become the U.S. because we didn't want to be part of that system anymore. Now, what you have to understand about China is Mao killed every single person that understood history. That was the first thing he did. He demonized the teachers. He demonized the sages. He demonized the wise men of the leaders and historians during his rise to power, and he had the students kill the teachers. Then he indoctrinated them
Right.
into the the Red Army, Communist
Sure.
Revolution, took over China, and now everyone is taught the exact same thing from a young age. If
The
you want to
difference.
understand China, You really need to understand North Korea because China and North Korea are far more similar than they are different. And
Okay.
North Korea is, yes, more brainwashed, but the culture in China is far more. The people in China, and this is the hardest thing for Westerners to understand, they do not care about themselves. They care about their legacy. They don't care about what they're going to eat for dinner. They care about what their grandchildren are going to eat for dinner. And
Okay.
that is
So
incredibly hard to understand, and it's a very Asian and uh, Eastern way of looking at things. They do not look at things in the span of a 10-month period, they look at it in the span of a 10-year period. So the difference between Russians and Chinese is massive,
okay.
and including us. It was very hard to understand that culture.
So a powerful China is not
A powerful
good.
China is
I'm asking
the death of America.
for your opinion.
A powerful China is the death of freedom.
Okay.
They don't believe in freedom
But
at all in any way.
a powerful Russia is
I don't think that
the closest thing
I
to it.
don't believe that a powerful Russia is good, but I don't think taking over Ukraine will make them a powerful Russia, anywhere near where they were with the USSR.
I don't know, man. I mean, fr- from from what you described, controlling more natural gas to Southern Europe, they basically will have a stranglehold on Europe.
Not any more than the Saudis do
Okay.
in regards to their gas. No, it's I mean, I believe you would have to. How what is the GDP of Russia?
I would probably guess 4 to 5 trillion.
Right. I mean that's
Maybe
less.
less.
That's less than California.
It's true, yeah.
Right. So you add, what's an additional, even let's say they double Ukraine, say it's 400 billion, right? Say they get to 5 billion or 5 trillion, right? GDP, that's still smaller than California. Like, they're not a threat
So
as long as we don't make them a threat. And I'm worried that with Ukraine, we will make them a threat. And it's a nuclear threat because they're
so let me ask one more
nuclearly
distinction.
capable.
Just to sidestep here. So you think a more powerful Russia is better than a more powerful Europe? Do you think? Well, okay. Is a powerful U.S.
Yeah.
better?
Yes.
It's better.
Depends who our leader is. Depends if we can.
Do you think
That goes into a whole nother
a weaker
conversation.
Europe? Do you think a weaker Europe is good for the U.S.?
Weaker in comparison to they are now.
Yeah.
No, I think a more populous Europe is better.
Okay. Okay. So, if you want Europe stronger, right?
Yeah.
You want Europe stronger, basically. If
I
it
want
doesn't
I want either
authoritarianism.
I want these countries to realize the authoritarianism that is within their government and cast it out.
Okay. Okay.
A lot of these European countries are really over the last 30 years have really returned to a class system.
Yeah.
And it's horrifying.
Okay. So I think
There are rules for the elite and then there are rules for the citizenry, and that's really what I'm against most.
yeah.
We need to have equal justice under the law.
Right.
If we don't have that, then you get chaos, and that's not
And
something I'm a fan of.
I would contend that Russia is an oligarch itself. Sorry, an oligarchy itself. Um, so it operates
I don't think Russia's
similarly.
more of an oligarchy than we are.
Okay, yeah. So populist, sure.
I they're they call it the line between pure the line between big capitalist and oligarch is almost indistinguishable. I believe in capitalism. I don't really like oligarchy, but I like both of those better than authoritarianism. But at this point, in the U.S. and in the EU, they've really transitioned from an oligarchy into authoritarianism, and in Europe or in Russia, they're still fairly oligarchical, and in the U.S. they are, but now those oligarchs have kind of turned into authoritarians that are trying to push their will on the masses.
Right. Well, shall we leave it there?